This is a lecture on Proverbs, chapter 1, verses 20 through 23, 20 through 33, Lady Wisdom and Woman Folly, as part one of a series on Lady Wisdom and Woman Folly. In this particular chapter, wisdom and fools will be introduced. One of the most interesting things about the book of Proverbs is how wisdom is personified in chapters 1 through 9 as a lady. And to a lesser degree, also folly is personified as a woman as well, particularly in chapter 9. And the choice is set before the reader of Proverbs chapters 1 through 9. Who are you going to choose? Lady Wisdom or Woman Folly? And momentous differences in consequence will ensue from this choice. And so let's look at the introduction to Lady Wisdom in verses 20 through 33, as she calls on fools and the naïve to listen to her. Wisdom cries aloud in the streets. In the market, she raises her voice. At the head of the noisy streets, she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates, she speaks. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffings and fools hate knowledge? If you turn my reproof, behold, I will pour out my spirit to you. I will make my words known to you. Because I have called to you and you refuse to listen, have stretched out my hand and no one has heeded, because you have ignored all my counsel and would have none of my reproof, I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when terror strikes you. When terror strikes you like a storm and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you. Then they will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but will not find me. Because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord, would have none of my counsel and despised all my reproof, therefore they shall eat the fruit of their way and shall have their fill of their own devices. The simple are killed by their turning away, and the complacency of fools destroys them. But whoever listens to me will dwell secure and will be at ease without dread of disaster. Lady Wisdom comes here, and she is Lady Wisdom for all. She enters the stage by calling out in the public squares, for her lessons are not just for an elite, an educated few, but for everybody. And it's interesting that wisdom is portrayed as a woman. Again, in certain traditional views of women are uneducated and foolish inherently, but not so here. Wisdom is personified as a woman. This woman is portrayed as quite bold and assertive. She's not at all passive. Something to bear in mind in dealing with biblical teaching about women. Now, in her message, she is addressing different types of fools. And three of them are going to be introduced here, the simple, mockers, and the fool. And we will spend some time learning a bit more about these character types that show up not only in this passage, but here and there throughout the book of Proverbs. And so let's start off. Verse 22 says, "How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple?" And then verse 32, "For the simple are killed by their turning away." Now, this is a Hebrew word pati, which is in some translations translated the simple. I'm using the English Standard Version. In other translations, the naive. And the parallelism suggests that the simple is a term for a young person. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 4, Proverbs are for, quote, giving prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Parallel with simple is the word young, which suggests that the simple are primarily young people. Likewise, Proverbs 7 and verse 7, it says, "I saw among the simple, I noticed among the young men, a youth who lacked judgment." And so it parallels with the word simple, young men, and youth. Now, this Hebrew word pati is used some 14 times in Proverbs, only 19 times in the whole Hebrew Bible. So it's mostly a word used in the proverbial literature. Now, the basic root of pati, translated simple or naive, may be patah, that seems to mean something like open or spacious. And if you take it that way, then the idea may be that, well, this is not a simpleton. It's not a simple Simon who met the Fryman in the old nursery rhyme, but rather he's someone that's open-minded, but too open-minded to good ideas and open-minded to bad ideas. He's someone who is undecided as to whether he's going to follow the path of wisdom. Now, this etymology is not certain, and I have in our notes that there's another option for understanding it that takes it in a different direction, but I'll just go with this for right now. In other words, the pati is open to enticements. For example, he's open to the enticement of the adulteress, who by flattery and seductiveness leads him down the path of death. You read about that in Proverbs 7, 6 through 27. But the pati is not overtly hostile to wisdom. The pati is simply undecided as to whether or not he is going to follow the path of wisdom. So he's a young person who is undecided about wisdom, and it says certain things about him that because he's not committed himself to the path of wisdom, well, he lacks sense or discernment. Chapter 9 and verse 16, "Whoever is simple, let him turn in here." That's Lady Wisdom calling him. "And to him who lacks sense," and then Lady Wisdom addresses him. The simple is somebody who lacks sense, who lacks discernment. Also, it says of the pati is gullible. Chapter 14 and verse 15, "The simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps." It also says that the pati is blind to dangers. Chapter 22 and verse 3, "The prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it." And then in chapter 1 and verse 32, the pati is wayward, tends to turn away from the right path. The simple are killed by their turning away, and the complacency of fools destroy them. They turn away, they're complacent. They are, in a word, wayward. And then chapter 14 and verse 18, the simple inherits folly. The simple inherit folly, but the prudent ones, the prudent are crowned with knowledge. So a lot of bad characteristics of the simple. They lack discernment, they're gullible, they're blind to dangers, they're not morally neutral, but they tend to be a little wayward and go astray. And they end up inheriting folly because of that. Now, of course, the petit does not remain a petit forever. He's kind of at the crossroads. He will either accept instruction and become wise, or he will reject instruction and become a fool. Now, perhaps you've met this character. I've seen them in churches over the years. They're the youth who sit in the back of the church, symbolically having one foot in the church and one foot in the world. Outside the church, they're open to activities that they ought to know better than to participate in. And people wonder, how will they turn out? Will they choose the path of divine wisdom or reject divine wisdom and become a fool? Again, a petit does not remain such forever. The petit will either choose the right path and become wise, or choose the wrong path and become a fool. And that's why the message of Proverbs is urgent to the petit, for he must become wise before the troubles of life overtake him. And that's why Lady Wisdom addresses him urgently. Because you have ignored all my counsel and you have done and would have none of my reproof, I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock you when terror strikes you. When terror strikes you like a storm and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me. Lady Wisdom will mock the petit for not listening in time in order that they could avoid the troubles and pitfalls in life. Now, how is it that a petit can become wise? Well, there's the easy way and the hard way. The hard way is to engage in unwise behavior and end up being punished for it. For example, Proverbs 19, verse 25, strike a scoffer, and the simple will learn prudence. Reprove a man of understanding, and he will gain knowledge. So when you punish a fool like a scoffer, well, the simple might learn indirectly that's not the path to go in. And so they can learn from other people's experience. That's better than learning from your own bad experience. You could also learn from your own bad experience. But here, the little better way, at least, is to learn when others suffer for their bad behavior, the scoffer in this case. A similar verse in 21:11, when a scoffer is punished, the simple become wise. When a wise man is instructed, he gains knowledge. Now, it's better to become wise by simply being instructed and following godly wisdom. But at least another path is to see what happens to people that don't do that. And that can be a path of moving in the direction of wisdom. Another way to learn is to accept God's reproof. Lady Wisdom, in the verses we were reading in chapter 1, 22 through 23, says to the simple, to the petit, how long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? If you turn at my reproof, behold, I will pour out my spirit on you, and I will make my words known to you. So if you accept wisdom's reproof, her spirit will be poured out on you and you can become wise like she is. Now, in the Psalms, the wisdom Psalms, it actually mentions listening to God's word as a way of gaining wisdom. Excuse me, Psalm 19 and verse 7, the statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the petty, the simple. Again, God's revelation, God's word can make the simple wise. Likewise, similar wisdom Psalm 119 and verse 130. The unfolding of your words gives light. It gives understanding to the simple. God's revelation is the best way for the simple to learn wisdom. Well, that's the character, the simple. And now I'm going to move on to a second character type, the mocker or the scoffer. And again, the mocker or the scoffer is also addressed in this passage by Lady Wisdom. The Hebrew word is lates. And if you analyze this word, you'll find that the mocker or the scoffer, he's a big talker. He's a loudmouth. He's a know-it-all who scorns wisdom. The root, the Hebrew word, the verbal root that is from is leets, which means to brag or to boast. So he's an arrogant boaster, as it says in Proverbs 21, verse 24. Scoffer is the name of the arrogant, haughty man who acts with arrogant pride. So scoffers are arrogant. Scoffers don't listen to rebuke. A wise son, this is Proverbs 13:1, a wise son hears his father's instruction, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. Proverbs 14:6 says that he's unable to find wisdom. A scoffer seeks wisdom in vain, but knowledge is easy for a man of understanding. Another characteristic of the scoffer is that he resents correction. Proverbs 9, verses 7 and 8. Whoever corrects a scoffer gets himself abuse. And he who reproves a wicked man incurs injury. Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. So unlike the wise, the scoffer, if you try to correct him, he'll abuse you. If you reprove him, he will hate you. A wise person will accept reproof gladly. Likewise, in 15:12, the scoffer, the Hebrew word lates, the scoffer does not like to be reproved. He will not go to the wise. He resents the reproof that the wise might give him, and so he will not go to them. Other verses about the scoffer, 22 verse 10, he stirs up strife. Drive out a scoffer, and strife will go out, and quarreling and abuse will cease. That loudmouth, the big talker, he causes trouble. He causes strife. Likewise, 29 and verse 8, scoffers set a city aflame, but the wise turn away wrath. Another thing it says about the mocker or the scoffer is that they devise folly, they bear their own bad consequences of what they do, and they might even end up getting flogged. 24:9, the devising of folly is sin, and the scoffer is an abomination to mankind. So he's associated with folly and sin. 9:12, if you are wise for yourself. If you scoff, you alone bear it. So he bears the consequences of his bad behavior. And then finally in verse 25, I'm not sure which chapter that is, strike a scoffer and the simple will learn prudence. Reprove a man of understanding and he will gain knowledge. That's chapter 19 and verse 25. Again, he might end up being struck, that is, flogged, punished physically for his bad behavior. And if you do that, well, the simple might learn prudence, but it's far better to simply accept reproof rather than resisting to the point of having to be punished by the state. God has no respect for this type of person. King James puts it this way: surely he scorneth the scorners, but he gives grace to the lowly, Proverbs 3:34, or another translation, the Lord mocks proud mockers, but gives grace to the humble. God has no respect for such a person, and neither should we. Well, let me move on to the next category of fool introduced by Lady Wisdom in Proverbs chapter 1, and that is the Hebrew word kasil. Now, there are other words for fool in Proverbs and the rest of the Bible. For example, there's the Hebrew word a wheel, which is used 19 times in Proverbs, also translated fool. Kidner thinks perhaps it's a stronger term for fool, referring to a person even more dense and stubborn than a kasil. Others question whether this is so, but in any case, that's another term for fool, perhaps an even stronger term. And then that's used 19 times in Proverbs. Another word used in Proverbs 3 times is the Hebrew word nabal. Nabal is the sort of person who rejects the first principle of wisdom, that is, fear of the Lord. As it says in Psalms 14:1, the Nabal has said in his heart, there is no God. So that's the fool that either rejects God's existence or his relevance. And he says, there is no God, or no to God at least. And he's, again, mentioned 3 times in Proverbs. But the term in Proverbs that's used most commonly is the Hebrew word kasil, and it's used quite often. Kasil is actually an adjective meaning foolish, but it's often used as a noun, and that's how it's mostly used. Occurs some 49 times in Proverbs, 18 times in Ecclesiastes, and 3 times in the Psalms, and thus it is the most common word for fool in Proverbs. And Lady Wisdom addresses this category of person, speaking derogatorily of the complacency of fools that destroys them. Proverbs 1:32. So what about this kasil? The Hebrew word is perhaps cognate with the Arabic kasilu, which means to be heavy. The root is used positively in kesel and kisla, which both mean confidence, perhaps having weight and so not easily swayed. It's also used in a negative sense in kasil, fool, heavy, perhaps in the sense of dull, thick, sluggish, dumb, foolish. Sabo in the article in the Theological Lexicon of the Old Testament under kasil. The waywardness of the simple will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. Now, what are the characteristics of the fool? Well, fools hate knowledge. It says that in Proverbs 1:22. How long will fools hate knowledge? Lady Wisdom says. Also, fools are complacent about wisdom. The complacency of fools will destroy them, Lady Wisdom says in Proverbs 1:32. A fool's mind wanders when wisdom is being taught. Proverbs 17:24. The discerning sets his face towards wisdom, but the eyes of a fool are on the ends of the earth. Your mind is a million miles away when wisdom is being taught to a fool. And fools are resentful of those that speak wisdom. Proverbs 23 and verse 9, it actually advises, do not speak in the hearing of a fool, for he will despise the good sense of your words. Fools are resentful of those that actually speak wisdom. Now, it turns out that this fool, he's the opposite of a wise person, but sometimes a fool will say something that's wise, but even a wise saying is lame when a Casil utters it. Proverbs 26 and verse 7, like a lame man's legs, which hang useless, is a proverb in the mouth of fools. In other words, even a wise saying is lame when a fool says it because, well, part of it is because the message does not fit the messenger, and thus does little for him to say it because his own behavior betrays the wisdom that comes out of his mouth. Not very convincing, you might say. Also, a fool twists wise sayings so that they're like a thorn brandished clumsily by a drunk who thereby endangers both himself and others. Proverbs 26 and verse 9, like a thorn that goes up into the hand of a drunkard, is a proverb in the mouth of fools. Now, in general, fools exhibit words of folly. Proverbs 12:23, the heart of fools proclaim folly. Proverbs 13 and verse 16, a fool flaunts his top folly. Proverbs 15 and verse 2, the mouths of fools pour out folly. Proverbs 15 and verse 7, the lips of the wise spread knowledge, not so the hearts of fools. Proverbs 15:14, the mouth of fools feed on folly. Their words are going to be foolish words as often as not. Now, the Casil is so self-assured that he doesn't listen to counsel. Proverbs 12:15, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. King James of that verse. What he will do is trust in his own heart, Proverbs 28, verse 26. He will be wise in his own eyes, Proverbs 16:12. He prefers instead to spout off his own supposed wisdom when he ought to be listening instead, Proverbs 18 and verse 2. Now, the fool has many vices. It says of him that he spreads slander, Proverbs 10:18. He considers shameful behavior a game to be enjoyed in Proverbs 10 and verse 23. He loses his temper easily, Proverbs 12 and verse 16 and 29 and verse 11. And he is deceitful, Proverbs 14 and verse 8. And you can't expect a fool to reliably convey a message. Proverbs 26:6. Whoever sends a message by the hand of a fool cuts off his own feet and drinks violence. Doesn't work. They're not reliable. Other vices. The words of the fool are perverse. Proverbs 19:1. Better is a poor person who walks in his integrity than one who is crooked in speech and is a fool. And so a fool is characterized by crooked speech, by perverse speech. Moreover, his bad speech, his mouthing off, starts fights and gets himself in trouble. Kind of like the scoffer, who's another particular type of fool. Proverbs 18, verse 6, a fool's lips walk into a fight, and his mouth invites a beating. A fool's mouth is his ruin, and his lips are a snare to his soul. The Casil, being addicted to the sweet pleasure of fulfilling evil desires, find it impossible to turn from evil, as it says in Proverbs 16 and verse 19. He repeats his foolish behavior in a way that a dog returns to his vomit. Proverbs 26:11, as a dog returns to his vomit, so a fool repeats his folly. It's disgusting, but it's what happens. A fool seems to learn nothing, even from a lashing. Proverbs 17 and verse 10, a rebuke goes deeper into a man of understanding than 100 blows into a fool. Or to go to another translation, a rebuke impresses a man of discernment more than 100 lashes a fool. Foolishness is ultimately self-destructive, as Lady Wisdom warns. The complacency of fools destroy them, and his behavior can earn him floggings and the rod. You get that in Proverbs 19:29 and 26:3, which the latter of which says, a whip for the horse, a bridle for the donkey, and a rod for the back of fools. That's what they're for. A Casil is not to be honored. No wise person should honor Casil, for that is as out of place as snow in the summer. As snow in the summer and rain in the harvest, so honor is not seemly for a fool. It's also as unseemly as tying a stone to a sling. It kind of defeats the purpose when you do such a thing. Proverbs 26 and verse 8. Now, what about a fool and wealth? Well, the wise consider a fool living in luxury incongruous, at least, though it acknowledges that sometimes it can happen. But typically, the fool squanders his wealth away, as Proverbs 1:20 and 21, verse 20 describe. Now, in terms of a fool and other people, the fool's parents are grief-stricken by his behavior, as Proverbs 10:1, 17:21, and 17:25 reflect. 10:1 says, a wise son brings joy to his father, but a foolish son brings grief to his mother. A wise son brings joy, a foolish son brings grief. And several proverbs are to that effect. His foolish behavior, in effect, is an expression of contempt for those who reared him, Proverbs 15 and verse 20, and is destructive to his parents' well-being, Proverbs 19 and verse 13, because they can expect no help from them in their old age, because after all, their son is a fool. Those who befriend a fool, a Casil, rather than the wise, will find themselves suffering harm from the bad influence. Proverbs 13 and verse 20, whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. Moreover, one who makes friends with fools will find ascertaining real wisdom more difficult. Proverbs 14 and verse 7. A Casil in his folly is as dangerous to be around as a mother bear robbed of her cubs. Let a man meet a she-bear robbed of her cubs rather than a fool in his folly. It's dangerous to be too closely associated with a fool. A fool also is like a drunkard in that he makes a very lousy employee. Proverbs 26 and verse 10. Like an archer who wounds everyone is one who hires a passing fool or a drunkard. You might as well hire a drunkard as to hire a fool, because you'll be destroying everybody that works for you. Like an archer who wounds everybody, hiring a fool will do harm to the whole business, as it were. Now, in describing the fool, that brings up a interesting verse that's worth mentioning. That's in Proverbs 26:4 and Proverbs 26:5, two verses right next to each other that look like they contradict each other. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself, Proverbs 26:4. But then the very next verse, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Are these proverbs contradicting each other? And I think the answer is no. One can do both, but it kind of equivocates on the expression according to his folly. In the first verse, do not answer a fool according to his folly. You can take that to mean something like, don't respond to a fool in a foolish way. In other words, as the New Bible Commentary puts it, one should not descend to that level of thought. To get into an argument with a fool makes one look like a fool himself. So don't respond in a foolish kind of way. Or as Kidner in his commentary puts it, to try to reason with the unreasonable is an exercise in foolishness. So don't respond in a foolish way. Don't foolishly try to reason with the unreasonable. Don't respond to a fool according to his folly. But on the other hand, do respond to a fool according to his folly in the sense of respond in the way that his folly deserves. In other words, as Delitzsch in his commentary puts it, firmly rejecting it, making short work of it, and exposing his folly for what it is. Now, you even have an example of that being done in the New Testament. As Kidner points out, the Apostle Paul felt constrained to speak foolishly to the Corinthians for the sake of communicating a rebuke to his foolish audience. And you'll see that in 2 Corinthians 12:11. And thus he's doing what this proverb says, answering a fool according to their folly. Well, Lady Wisdom in chapter 1 calls on each of these fools, the simple, the scoffer, and the fool himself, to repentance. But what we have just seen, these fools, and especially the scoffer and the Casil, the fool himself, are inclined to ignore and resist wisdom. And so she goes on to rebuke them. If you turn at my reproof, behold, I would pour out my spirit to you. I will make my words known to you. Because you have called, and because I have called and you refuse to listen, I have stretched out my hand and no one has heeded. Because you have ignored my counsel and would have none of my reproof, I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when terror strikes you, when terror strikes you like a storm, and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you. That's chapter 1, 23 through 27. Lady Wisdom will mock them for having ignored her, and they will reap the result of their ignoring of her wisdom. So the essence of Lady Wisdom's message to the fools is that she will mock those who ignore her advice and so bring calamity on themselves. But on the other hand, those who learn from her, she promises safety and protection. Verse 33, whoever listens to me will dwell secure and will be at ease without dread of disaster. Note that rejecting wisdom is associated in verse 29 with rejecting the fear of the Lord. Fear of the Lord has to do with godliness or piety. For the message of wisdom is ultimately the message of God. Godly wisdom is God's wisdom. You see, God wove into the fabric of the world the principles of living that can guide us through life's pitfalls and lead us to true happiness. Wisdom conveys those principles of living. Likewise, foolishness is to pursue evil and in disobedience to the commands of God in the law. So Lady Wisdom is on the side of God and God's word, whereas Woman Folly is the opposite. And thus you have a choice. The admonition is clear: respond to wisdom's rebuke, accept her advice if you wish to avoid shipwrecking your life, for she is God's wisdom. So the truly godly will listen and follow her advice. So that's part one of our study of Lady Wisdom and Woman Folly. And we will continue with more on Lady Wisdom and Woman Folly on the next video. And I am Dr. Joe Sprinkle.